We're ready to attach the collar to the blouse now. So if we open up our blouse and then this is our neckline here, okay? Let's fold back our facings and see we have a whole circle here, all right? Basically, so here's my two necklines. This is the one on my bodice, that's one on my yoke facing. That's my center back right there and there. I'm going to find the center back on my collar. All right, make sure you have the right side of your collar. This is the right side because that's the one the basting is in. That's how I know it's my upper collar. I'm going to take the center back notch of my collar, find my notches at center back, right there and there, and I'm going to take my collar, and the under collar is going to go against my blouse. All right, the right side of my blouse is what's going to be going against my under collar. Okay, and I'm lining up my center back notches. So under collar against the right side of the blouse. Center back notches, lining them up. Okay. And then put a pin in. And now I'm going to find the notch for my shoulder seam and match those up as best I can. The shoulder seam is diagonal, so the notch may not match up perfectly, but that's okay. And make sure the shoulder seam stays pressed towards the yoke, okay? And then here we have our three notches. This is going to come to the first notch. See, 1, 2, 3. This comes to that first notch, all right? If it doesn't line up perfectly, that's okay, but you don't want it to go beyond that first notch. So the edge of the collar should come to about that first notch. Okay, there's going to be a little ease in the collar, and that's fine. All right, and then pin out the other way, the exact same way. And make sure that shoulder seam is facing in towards your yoke. And then that collar comes out to the first of the three notches. And those are the three notches. The middle notch is basted. That's the one we basted. Okay, so now it's pinned. So what we're going to do now is go to the machine, the sewing machine, and we're going to stay stitch the collar on. Okay. Okay, go ahead and just stay stitch it on from one end to the other. And make sure when you go over your shoulder seams, notice I have the collar against the feed dogs. The blouse is up against the presser foot. Make sure your shoulder seams, when you stitch over them, they go towards the yoke, okay? And when you come around the shoulder, you're basically stitching, the collar's neckline is pretty straight compared to the blouse's neckline that you're sewing it to. So think of our curved seam demo. We're sewing kind of two opposite seams, or two opposite panels together. So you're just going to have to go slowly. And in the shoulder, a lot of fabric tends to bunch up there. So go slow through it, take a few stitches, then adjust, and then continue on. Okay? Again, make sure that shoulder seam stays pressed towards the yoke, and that when you stitch over it doesn't push it out the other way. Because if you do, then it won't be hidden within the yoke facing once we finish that. Alright, now that's sewn, we need to close up our neckline. So put the blouse back together as if it were sewn, like so. Alright, and then open up that hole again. Alright, there's my collar on the inside. Now I'm going to find my center back notches of my yoke facing. That's my yoke facing, and of my blouse back. And I'm going to line up those center back notches and go ahead and put a pin in. And now I'm going to go out in one direction. So you can see there's my yoke facing. I'm basically sandwiching the collar between my yoke facing and my blouse. Here, see the 3 notches? Okay, you want to fold this right sides together and bring those 2 outside notches together. Okay, the center notch is the one we basted. And put a pin in. And now we'll continue pinning. Okay, so there's my 2 shoulder seams, my blouse shoulder seam, and then my facing shoulder seam. I'm going to bring those together and pin those. Alright, so we're sandwiching our collar between our blouse, the body of our blouse, and our blouse facings. So again, I'm folding back those 3 notches so it's inside out. Remember we pressed on the basting line down our center front? Okay, so that crease should be folded the other way now. And again, I'm pinning shoulder seam. Make sure that the shoulder seams are facing towards the yoke, okay? So one side you've already stitched the collar on, that should be fine. The other side, the facing side, make sure those shoulder seams are going towards the yoke, all right? There we are. It's been pinned together and the collar is sandwiched between the facings and the body of the blouse. So now we'll just go and stitch this at 1/2 inch. Now there may be a little ease in there, so stitch carefully. You might have to kind of work things through with your fingers and a little bit, so go slow. But you can do it. And I'm going to stitch right on my other stitching, my stay stitching line here. And I'll stitch from one side all the way to the other and back tack. And remember to watch your shoulder seams, that when you stitch them, that they're facing towards the yoke. And just slowly work it through. And again, remember you have like your collar, which is more of a straight seam. The neckline of your collar is sewing between 2 very curved seams. Okay, so it does take a little maneuvering, a little adjusting as you go. You can see me checking things, you know, kind of moving things around. But just go slow and then back tack when you get to the end. Okay, there it is, stitched. Okay, so now check it. Make sure there's no puckers or fabric ain't folded under. Okay, that looks good. Now, there should be about a 1/2 inch between, I think 1/2 inch to 5/8 between their collar and your edge of your blouse. If there's not, if your collar comes all the way out to the edge of your blouse, then you did something wrong. And now I'm clipping the corners down at the edge of my blouse, okay? And I'm going to clip out the seam allowance of the shoulder seams that got caught in the neckline to reduce this bulk, because it's very bulky there. And now I'm going to clip all the way down to my stitching line about every 5/8 of an inch. All right, because remember, this is a curved seam. And what do we do with curved seams? We clip them so that we'll fold this right side out, and the seam allowance needs to be able to pull apart to lay correctly. And the collar that's sandwiched between the 2 seams is straight, so it needs to be able to curve correctly. So we need to stitch through or clip through all layers down to our stitching line, but not through it. All right, I'm going to take my point turner and at the 2 ends of the collars, I'm going to turn out my blouse, and you can see here there's about 5/8, 1/2 inch between. I'm just clipping some threads there. where my collar ends and my blouse ends, okay? If your collar comes all the way to the end of that, then there's something wrong. You need to have a space. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to understitch. So here's my facing side, and what we're going to do is push all our seam allowance towards our facing, yoke facing. We're going to understitch from one shoulder seam to the other shoulder seam, okay? So again, this is just from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. And it's on the the yoke facing side, and I'm pushing all the seam allowance towards my yoke facing, and I'm going to understitch. When we understitch, make sure you understitch about 1/16 of an inch away from the seam. And notice I'm pulling my two pieces in opposite directions, my yoke facing to one side and my collar to the other. And remember, you clipped that seam allowance, okay? So check it to make sure it's not flipping underneath in the opposite direction. All right, I made it to the other shoulder seam, so I'm going to clip now my threads. There we go. All right, now we're going to press my corners here. And since I flipped it right back out, I'm going to press my fold line of the front of my blouse a little bit, just to get it back into shape. There we go. And there's our collar. Now what I like to do, you don't have to do this, I like to pull my yoke facing down and make sure my blouse is nice and pulled down and taut away from my collar. And then I like to just give a very gentle press right at where my collar attaches to my blouse. You do not have to do this necessarily, but I think it's something good. It gets it nice and flat. I'm just using, it's hard to tell here, but I'm just using the tip of my iron, and I'm just pressing at the seam where the two connect, the collar and the blouse, okay? Don't press everything else. And I'm making sure that I'm pulling my collar in one direction, the blouse in the other, and that there are no, underneath there or on top, there's no folds or puckers or ripples, because we don't want to press those into our blouse. All right. So now you have successfully attached your collar to your blouse. And I'll tell you, this is the hardest part of this blouse, okay? So from here on out, it's not too bad. So good job, everyone. Now we're going to move on to sewing our side seams. And I'll just show you very quickly what it looks like so far. Okay. There it is. All right, side seams next.